And then in the conclusion, I say, some who've been following my argument thus far might be tempted to resign from the practice of feminism. I've been painting a picture of a world capitalist system whose leaders thoroughly absorb progressive ideas and transform them into propaganda and strategies in pursuit of their own interests. It might appear, therefore, that all activism, feminist or otherwise, is hopeless, since it will just feed into the giant maw of corporate expansionism. So I do try, in the conclusion, to look at some directions for the women's movement, which I think can start to recoup some of this damage. And I'll just mention them very fast, and if you want in the discussion, I can say more. I talk about, first of all, putting socialism back on the feminist agenda. I talk about mending the break of feminism with the left, which goes back quite a few decades. I talk about reinforcing the idea of an anti-racist and anti-imperialist feminism. I talk about recognizing the significance of class and looking at one hopeful thing, which is the growth of service industry unions which have women's leadership and which have a feminist agenda. Very, very interesting. Specifically, my favorite is the Nurses Union out in California, which is a fabulous group. And then, what else do I say? I talk about decoupling feminism from capitalist modernity. I'm trying to break down the argument that to be modern, you have to be capitalist. And that sort of wipes out the whole history, for example, of the Chinese Revolution and the beginnings of the Russian Revolution, where there was another path for women's liberation, and Cuba today, which is still keeping in that tradition. And then I talk about rethinking the role of the state, and I talk a little bit about Venezuela. I'm arguing that you can't, as I said, you can't develop a country by giving a few women microcredit. However, you can develop a country and move toward ending poverty with a strong state apparatus like Chavez and his government has in Venezuela, in connection with and in close collaboration with grassroots organizing. You certainly can't do it only from the top, but I don't think you can do it only from the bottom either. So I make a little pitch for the feminist character of the Venezuelan Bolivarian Revolution. And then my last point is I go back to the notion of how the women's movement has really kind of tried to wipe out the idea of gender. I call it the abolition of gender, and have women be just like men. And I guess it's an old argument I end up with. I'm basically saying, no, let's go back to the idea of women as nurturing, but let's make everybody be like that. Let's make people be like that, and let's make the state be like that. And then we might have a kind of world that we could be comfortable in. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Martha. So then now we'll hear some commentary from Dorothea. And
sure. I just want to start by being honest with folks. When I first got the invitation from Liz, I right away said, I'm running away from this. Enough of this academia, intellectual BS. Because in my experience, every time I'm invited to talk at a panel discussing a book or a theory, etc., I always leave it so confused. And I'm like, what are these lingos they're using? What the hell is going on? And I had to run to my political work, my political activism, to ground myself. Mm-hmm. And I've worked with, like Liz said, I've worked with Gabriella Network since, actually I've been involved in it since 1991. And this has been my experience, for the most part, when I get involved in discussions with people in academia. And I have to be, we can't not see the fact that there is a gap between the activist community and the academia. So I said, I'm not doing this. I've got important things to do. But then I read on. I said, okay, Feminism, Seduced. That sounds good. That sounds seductive. And I read on about globalization and the co-opting of feminist ideas and energies. And I'm like, oh, okay, this is getting more interesting. And I read on about globalization and structural adjustment programs, etc., imperialism. I said, oh, okay, this aligns with my political ideas. Very good. So I said, Liz, this sounds interesting. Yes, I'd like to be part of the panel. And I read the book. Actually, just today. Excuse me, Hester. I've been away, and I was sick while I was away, and I'm just recuperating now. But I read the book, and I do agree with most of the stuff that Hester outlined, her arguments, etc. Although there are some omissions, and I'm sure she didn't mean to omit them. For example, when she talked about globalization and women's labor as part of largely immigrant women's organizing, we've never separated women's issues from the issue of imperialism or colonialism and globalization. This was part of our reality, so it was never separated. I'm here because of globalization. My mother was recruited as a nurse back in the 70s. And she actually was a teacher in the Philippines for nurses, hoping to come to America and the Middle East as nurses. And I have family who are in the Middle East as part of the export of labor that is part of the globalization that Hester talks about in the book. So for us, it was never separated. And another thing that I want to point out, and I do agree with Hester's claim about the mainstream feminists not being broad enough, having a narrow view. And I have direct experience with this when we were organizing against trafficking back in the early 90s. We had approached a major women's organization to do a anti-trafficking rally, a march on a Women's Day. And they came back to us and said, that's an international issue, that's not a domestic national issue, we don't touch there. We don't touch that. And we were flabbergasted because we had to actually explain to them that this is an international phenomenon, but it has its roots in your country, damn it. And they did agree, some of the members did agree to support and be part of this march against trafficking that we did. This was back, I think, in 1994. When Hester talked about women work and mainstreaming of feminism, I would love to have seen more about the role of immigrant women. The fact that they come here and take care of the home for the so-called liberated women, take care of the home, take care of the kids, etc. And how is that? I would have loved to see more of that. And how does that play into the further oppression of these immigrant women and also the further integration of so-called liberated women into the economy? But has a fabulous book. I agree with what she says about women replace development. And in the Philippines, as I think she mentioned it here, the president, Corazon Aquino, one time called women, Filipino women, as modern-day heroes. She was quoted in this. They're modern-day heroes because they're the ones who leave the country and work abroad as nurses, domestic workers, prostituted women, whatever, and send money back to the Philippines. I think it's up to 7 billion nowadays, but that's formally transferred. And we're estimating more like 10 billion when you count all the informal avenues where people send money and goods to the Philippines. And there's, I think, about 10 million Filipinos, Filipinas around the world in 180-something countries. And that is very real to me, the point that women replace development that Hester makes in the book. And the structural adjustment programs, that's very real to me. And that argument is, I think, very concrete in the book. The whole idea of microlending as helping women. I mean, I didn't see any women in the Philippines being helped by these things. And actually, they became more entrenched in poverty because of the microlending. I think it was 30% you said here, but the women that I've spoken with in the Philippines, they said it was up to 45% interest.
Wow.
So this was going on back in the early 90s. I don't know how much it's going on now. And the part that really, really interested me in this book is Hester's proposition about how we can further feminism. Well, first we have to make feminism relevant to women. And we were just joking around before we started, and Liz said, "Oh, I guess this is the state of the women's movement." And I said, "Yeah, this is it." And I said, "Hester, we got to make feminism relevant to women again because they don't see it as relevant to their lives anymore." And for immigrant women and women of color, they kind of shy away from the idea of feminism because historically, as you've outlined in the book, their issues have been relegated or not even mentioned. So I think that would be the very first task for us feminists to make it relevant to women's lives. And another thing that I would love for Hester to dive into more, maybe in her next book, is the idea of cultural imperialism and how this is used to tell women and men, but mostly women in the Philippines especially, because that's where I'm from and that's what I know, that life in the developed countries are much better. I think this, you kind of touched upon it in the Islamophobia chapter, but it plays a lot in the neo-colonialism. I'm talking about cultural imperialism from your diet to the way you think, the things that you read, the things that you watch, and how you want to look, and the things that you want to acquire. The diet part is a big part of cultural imperialism in the Philippines when they dumped a whole bunch of these pancake mix or whatever in the Philippines back in the 50s and 60s. They're like, pancake mix, what the hell is this? We're rice people. So now you have these high carbs diet, and it has contributed to this high rate of diabetes in the Philippines. I'm borderline diabetic. And the rice that we eat now are these processed rice that's imported from Malaysia and Vietnam and Thailand. I don't know why we import rice. It's an agricultural country, and we have the Rice Institute in the Philippines that's supposed to be the best in the world, but yet we import rice. Okay, that makes a lot of sense. And of course, for women, it's this idea of, I know it's been said before over and over and over again, but colonialism does something to the people's psyche, to the people's culture. It does something to how they look at themselves and how they are, and how they relate to themselves, and how they carry themselves and how they navigate in the world. You know, you still have Filipino women, and I'm sure a lot of women of color around the world that are looking to be white women because, you know, that's what we're told is better. It's still true. I mean, when I was growing up here on 13th Street, my mother told me to pinch my nose 50 times a night so that it'll be as high as a white woman's nose. And I did. But it didn't work. But I'm okay. But I'm okay with that. But these are the things that we read, the things that they watch in the Philippines, the movies, etc. These are the things that go on in the people's psyche. And I would, like I said, I would love to have heard more about cultural imperialism in the book. As far as Hester's proposal on how we can move on. Thrust? No, not thrust. Her first suggestion on how can feminists put the critique of capitalism and the discussion of socialism back on the agenda. Like I said before, for some of us, it has never left. Thank God. Not that I believe in God, but anyway. It's just an expression. I'm co-opting their expressions. Anyway. So it was always anti-capitalist for us. It was always anti-imperialist for us. Second, she proposes, can the break between feminism and the left be mended? That's a long, long struggle. Okay. Okay. Yeah, we should try. Yeah, okay, why not? But yeah, why not? But I'm curious as to how the women in Nepal are organizing. And I've read documents, I don't know how true it is in practice, about how class struggle is alongside women's emancipation. Like I said, it's just in document. I don't know how it is in practice. I've never been to Nepal, and I've never really studied their movement there. But I would love to study and see how did the class struggle and the women's movement, play together there. And third, how can feminism be both anti-racist and anti-imperialist? For me, you can't be a feminist if you're not both. It's just the reality for a lot of people. And fourth, how can the women's movement address class issues effectively? And I think Hester's point about the union organizing. We need to go back to union organizing as political organizing. I was a union organizer for a few years, and I know a lot of union organizers out there still, and it's not part of the agenda. Political education is. Yeah, they have political action committees, yes, but it's not really part of the agenda to talk about politics or whatever with the membership. So I think would you call that politicization? Something about union organizing, going back to its roots. Fifth, is there a way to decouple modernity from capitalism? Capitalism is not modernity, actually. It's old. It's barbaric. It's God. It's outmoded. For crying out loud. Yeah. But as we see, it's so inventive. I mean, it can come up with things to resolve contradictions within. I mean, it's very inventive. It's very creative. We need to be better creators.